Alright, I really hope this is working properly. This is Kara Dreamer, again, talking about Magick. And it's not working properly. What is going on here? So, I recently switched to made the mistake of switching to Linux, for God's sake. Which means that I don't know if anything is actually working the way that it should. Like there is a buggy beta version of OBS that I'm trying to use right now, and it seems at least to be sending video, and I hope audio. However, YouTube on Chromium is telling me that I can't actually view my own stream. God, let me see if I could try to find out whether... as long as people can hear me, I don't quite give a shit that I can't see it. But, I mean, it is kind of a nice monitor, if nothing else. And I really don't know why this is happening. Oh, God, what is... Your browser does not currently recognize any of the video formats available. What the fuck does that mean in this case? Jesus. Let me double check something here. Okay. How do I do this? How do I do this? Hang on a second. Okay, let's see here. Yep, looks like it's actually displaying shit, and I can hear myself talk. So that's all that matters for the moment. But yeah, if I'm gonna keep on doing this, I'm going to have to figure out how why exactly it's. I'm just getting this, your browser does not currently recognize video format nonsense. I don't know why I inflicted this Linux stuff on myself, but it was... My Windows 7 installation is getting really long in the tooth, and I was not going to run Windows 10, holy shit. That kind of left free software as my only option. And so nothing is really quite working the way that it should. I've been kind of using my, for backgrounds, I've been using a visualizer on Windows called Plane 9 that's got some really nice stuff, and there's no Linux version. And so I'm trying to make do with this kind of crude Project M visualizer to give me some video that people can actually watch. Anyway. Oh, I had one viewer for like a moment. So, anyway. Enough on that. Enough on technical problems. It's time to start talking about Magick again. And I've been going on a bit about how I got to where I've been going and talking about Wicca and Catholicism and the role that furry and otherkin played, and then I finished talking about an actual spiritual experience. And well, now that background's out of the way, that really does bring me, and it would bring this broadcast mostly up to the present day. There's some stuff from the past that I'm gonna bring up a little bit of it right now, and but I want to start talking about what magic with the K actually means to me, and what I want to do with it and how I want to go about doing it, because there's one thing that I really, really want to stress here, which is I don't really know what I'm doing. I am very unschooled, and what information I have picked up over the years has been fragmentary from multiple sources, and yet, despite this complete lack of reference, I've been going around saying, "Oh, I do magic," calling myself a witch and stuff like that. And well, I want to talk a bit about that. Like, in what sense do I mean these words when I'm using them? So, just a second. So, anyway, I want to start, I guess, by talking about, well, what did I used to mean by magic? Which I didn't really start spelling with a K, by the way, regularly until pretty recently, and I'll get into that. I mean, when you're a kid, or when I was a kid anyway, now I didn't read a lot of fantasy literature. Unfortunately, my parents, by which I mean basically my mom, didn't really like me reading anything or viewing anything that was too fanciful. She had that thing that a lot of abusive parents have of trying to make their kid act more grown up because it's easier for them to deal with. But still, you can't help but pick up some idea that magic is like spells. Magic is it's a character from some fantasy story or from some cartoon or whatever, saying some words and maybe employing some objects, some accoutrements like a wand or ingredients of a spell or something like that, and then stuff happens. It's changing something. It's changing the world, like the physical world, by simply doing it by utterance and by manipulating objects. And, well, that sounds very general, obviously. And that kind of childish, or not childish is kind of a bad word for it, that childlike, that naive view of magic it's really what goes into the sci-fi geek's beloved Clark's Law about magic, which is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from it. Well, that's only assuming that magic is about like making stuff happen in this sort of crude physical sense. And sort of fast forward to the present, I don't think magic is that anymore. Obviously, it's something you do because you want things to happen, but I don't see it as making arbitrary things happen. See, that's the thing about the childlike view of magic, is that it just arbitrary, like anything can happen, like literally anything. Like you see it most fully in any kind of children's story where like you could be turned into any object. Like someone could just turn you into a frog, or you can make food appear out of nowhere. Like Harry Potter magic, basically. It's whatever you want, you just say the right thing, and it happens. And I see magic now as it is something that has to operate in the realm of the probable. maybe very low probability. You are, to my mind, magic is about looking at the tree of possibilities that opens up in front of you. At every moment of your life, you're faced with an infinitely branching array of possible futures. Magic, to me, is about influencing which of those branches you are more likely to go down. So it is never a sure thing. Magic is never sure. And neither is life. I mean, surprise, surprise. And anyway, things started to change for me about what I thought magic was when I got into Wicca, as you might imagine. And I talked about how like 95% of why I got into that was simply because I thought doing spell stuff, at least the way that I saw my Wiccan friends do it, was just cool. Like, it was getting at that very... It was accessing that very childlike notion of magic that it's about doing spells with things. Like, you can have wands, you can have magic circles, and all this stuff. And that's very important, because ritual is something that speaks to us. Doing things with sacred knives and sacred sips of wine and so forth, it all touches something in us. But is it itself magic? Well, no. I mean, it's just arbitrary action otherwise. And the thing that I never really got a clear picture of, though, while I was in Wicca that first time, was just what did people imagine was their spell work, all of these manipulations that I'm talking about, what did they imagine they were doing? And I try to think of, well, what did I think was happening? I only had a very crude sort of mental image of what I imagined was happening, and that too was important, although it took me a long time to realize that. I was not able to start being actually able to do magic with any sort of conviction and feel like I was actually accomplishing something until I had a mental image that satisfied more or less all the parts of my brain, at least a bit. Both the mystical side and the rational side and all the other sides. I wasn't able to do magic until I came up with a kind of internal model of, well, what am I actually doing? What's going on? And without that model, I was just sort of fumbling around, whistling in the dark, however you want to put it. I suppose that if I had any sort of idea, it was more, I thought of magic as akin to something like prayer. With prayer, you're definitely you're doing stuff, you're uttering words, and maybe even God, let me start that sentence over again. That was about to get overcomplicated. So let me roll back slightly. Now, because as I've mentioned, I was raised by atheists, or at least people who were irreligious. I had no background of prayer, even in a Christian sense. It was not something that I was trained to think of as a way of interacting with the world. But I at least had the sort of basic image that, well, you imagine that there are supernatural powers out there, gods, and you say things to them, and maybe you do ritual things that add force to what you're saying, or that the gods, for whatever reason, like you to do. And you say the things and you do the things, and your hope is that this message gets through, and that then the gods that you're trying to appeal to help get done the thing that you want done. Again, the emphasis is kind of on results, on definite results. And I mean, it's an image, and definitely what I saw from an actual Wiccan practice seemed in line with that. There was lots of talk of the goddess, and a little bit of talk about the Horned One. Wicca is really kind of... well, I don't think Wicca has that great a sort of theology to work with, but, well, anyway. The thing is, though, that kind of religious faith, the idea that you've got definite... like, you know, that, again, sorry, I'm being a little bit rough here with my speech. You know, I just didn't, I didn't have enough faith in that kind of view of the supernatural to really have much faith that, that spells that I was involved in did anything. It felt like wishful thinking, you know? Which is, by the way, more or less how I felt later on when I decided to make a go of Catholicism. I tried to get into a habit of prayer then, and I was instructed by various sources that prayer was something that I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to be talking to God all the time, forming a sort of relationship with God. And I tried to do that with church going and praying in church, and even, yeah, I never made too regular a habit of praying outside of church, but still it was something that I tried to do. And again, there was this sense of one-way communication. I felt like I was getting on my knees and talking to air or to the wall or something like that, and the consolation that I was supposed to be offered was that, well, you know, you're just supposed to have faith that it's getting through, and really you're not supposed to be assuming you're going to get results. Like like C.S. Lewis in particular, in some of his Christian apologetic works, and he brings this up in Screwtape Letters too, is all like, no, you know, like it's a mistake to go into prayer just assuming that it's going to make you, that it's going to accomplish anything, or even that it's going to make you feel a certain way. Like, that's just a wrong way of looking at it. Like, you're just supposed to be presenting God with info that helps him decide, like, what, you know, how to influence events. With Wiccan spellcraft, it's supposed to be a bit more definite than that. You know, you're there's at least supposed to be, I think, less of a sense that accessing the gods is sort of this read-only thing, or write-only thing, where it's just like, yeah, you sort of do your thing and then hope for the best. In fact, there's kind of carried into Wicca from the 19th and 20th century occultists that Wicca basically kind of cribbed all their stuff from. So, you know, people like the Aleister Crowley ceremonial magic set, they were very clear on the fact that doing spells was you were supposed to be doing something to the universe. You were putting your will out there. And to use the formulation that I had learned at the time and that I've quoted since then, that and it harm none, if it harms nobody, do what thou wilt. That's what doing a spell was supposed to be. It was supposed to be about impressing your will on the universe in some fashion. Now, I think that in practice, Wicca, as it's actually practiced in contemporary neo-pagan communities, it kind of softens that whole you're impressing your will business, because I think a lot of people go into Wicca because they're looking for something fairly safe, fairly fluffy. They want the positive social aspects of religion. They want community, and they want to do fun stuff with people they like. And so I think a lot of the people that I ran into in my time in neo-paganism weren't even necessarily really that into spells. Like the public rituals that we participated in had the aspect of spells. There was always some kind of shared ritual involved that had the character of a spell, maybe. But I don't think a lot of the people that I knew were really into impressing their will on anything, and neither was I, for that matter. Although I did have some idea, very vague idea at the time, that if this stuff was maybe the way that I should be looking at it, I thought once or twice, was that maybe it's psychological. Like maybe in casting a spell, I'm actually changing my mind rather than the universe. Now, that was moving in the direction that I am now going in, but I had no real clear idea of psychology, other than vaguely, well, it's stuff that happens in your head. I had no clear picture back then of how my mind even worked, so really that line of thinking wasn't getting me anywhere at the time. So, well, okay, that was a bit of the past, but what do I think is going on now? I've made some allusion to talking about probabilities. That what's the best way to bring this up? I have a background in the physical sciences. As I've said, I'm largely a chemist by education, although I also have a degree in computer science, and I also have a degree in classics. That's studying Latin and ancient Greek language and literature and so forth. And I got that degree at the same time that I got my CS degree. But and while, as I've mentioned in previous broadcasts, that classics education would turn out to be really important to how I developed, that the science background is what's exerted the strongest influence in my life for many decades now. I'm 43 years old. And one of the things that I studied when I was getting my master's degree in chemistry was quantum chemistry. And I am not going to pretend that I can explain quantum mechanics very well. I will say only here that the most important lesson to get from quantum mechanics, and one that I have applied to my view of what magic is all about and what it does, is that you realize that at a fundamental level, the universe is analog. It is blurry. And that there is no sense in speaking of things definitely being in a place. Like an electron in a... Let's take a... forget even talking about a hydrogen atom. Let's talk about a hydrogen molecule, H2. Where can you speak of the electron in its electron cloud around the two nuclei? It's not in an orbit. It isn't even necessarily speaking in an orbital. So quantum mechanics has replaced the idea of an electron orbit, which is a fixed path in space that this discrete particle goes round. It replaces that idea with the idea of an orbital. An orbital is... You could speak of it as a region in space, but even that is not quite correct. Because actually an orbital fills all of space. There's, no matter what orbital an electron is occupying, there is a non-zero probability everywhere in space that you might find the electron there if you look. And I think that is more or less the view of reality that has enabled me to start thinking of magic as something that I can do. When I stopped thinking of the things that I want, basically going back to that childlike conception that magic, a spell, is something that you want to happen, and that you make it happen by doing something. That it was vital for me to realize that there is no such thing as a fixed eventuality. All there is this sort of fluid sense of shifting probabilities that at every moment you can kind of look sort of dimly into the future at all the myriad possibilities and think, okay, like this particular future is something that I would like to happen, but it is very improbable that it will simply happen. And that there are myriad influences that affect that probability. And my job as a witch, as a magician, is to recognize what some of those influences might be and exert as much power as I possibly can over them. And the strongest sort of source of influence, the thing that you can affect, the thing that you can affect the most change on, that is going to exert the greatest influence over the probability of something happening or not, is you. How you interact with the world is the thing that most strongly affects those probabilities of desired events happening or not. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that it's all supposed to be you. That's the trouble. The trouble with talking about, I'm not just talking about magic, but about any kind of philosophy or worldview where you put primacy on the individual to change themselves. That you know, that it's like change starts with you, and you know, and you're supposed to visualize success. And you can think of all this kind of stuff. A lot of which kind of figured into that earlier neo-pagan community sort of vague sense of magic that I had picked up. That insofar as people had ideas about spellcraft that were more than just, you know, kind of like, well, you know, I'm asking the gods for this to happen. That if there was any sort of sense of self-actualization going on, it was just in this kind of, I think, vague pop psychological sense that you just, you know, if you sort of visualize things that you want to happen, then hopefully that will make them more likely to happen. It's not quite so simple. Like, I'm going to bring up in particular a spell that I was a participant in back in like 2000 or 2001 with the this little coven that I was kind of an on-off member of for about a year. And two of my friends from this little group once did a spell in which I participated, in which they were, you know, they wanted to do some kind of spell in connection with hoping to achieve a degree of financial success. And then I cringed inwardly when I saw them do this. I didn't say anything about it, but I still remember just like, oh no, is this really what you're hoping? That they produced a lottery ticket, and they did a spell to magic the lottery ticket. And here I am talking about probability. Now, there are a lot of things that are going to happen or not going to happen where you'll never know what the actual probabilities are. Like you're never going to get measures of these things. And you really, you know, the act of being alert to these possibilities is important for a practitioner of magic, I think. And if there's one definite future event where you can be actually quite sure that the probability of its happening is low, so low as to be almost non-existent, and that you can actually, you yourself have no influence over, it's the outcome of a lottery ticket. You know, who wins or doesn't win a lot, you know, in the lottery doesn't have anything to do with you, except in the sense that maybe you'll be lucky enough to, you know, like maybe if you think you have some insight into a random or pseudo-random process being used to pick numbers, and you hope to pick winning numbers. Well, I really don't think that you could start. Basically, you can't go into a spell that handicapped. You can't just hope to make that dramatic a change. Because, think of it this way also. You're not just saying, okay, I'm going to do a spell that makes this that I'm hoping is going to make this 1 in a billion chance of something that is not decided by me, that I'm going to make that happen with my magic. And it's not just that, you're also affecting the outcomes of literally millions of other people who also want to win the lottery. And, yeah, like, just with that huge, with the deck stacked that much against you, you know, wanting something completely improbable, and something that is decided by machinery and people that you have zero influence over, and which also intersects with the hopes and dreams of everyone else in town. Yeah, I just think that's a terrible way to think about it. And the thing is, though, that's kind of on that sort of idea about what you can do with a spell really is kind of based on that sort of strictly intercessional view of it. That you're asking the gods to help you win the lottery, because who else is going to have that kind of power to affect something that low probability and which touches so many other people? Yeah, like you're asking for a miracle, and I just don't think that magic is about asking for miracles. That really is the domain of prayer. And well, to me, magic is actually I think of it as distinct from prayer these days. I mean, there is an aspect, because one of the things that you know gives force to a spell is appealing to a god or goddess or deity to sort of help you along. But it's definitely more than just, you know, I want something to happen, you know, please make it happen, you know, Tiamat or whatever. So anyway, well, so here I am talking about sort of low probability events, and you know, versus you know, higher probability events, and well, like how do you gauge that exactly? Well, I mean, a lot of it really is just trusting to your own observation and judgment, and so, you know, one of the things that I have had to do, and that I need more and more and more practice at, is simply being mindful, trying to read the signs. So this brings up another aspect of what I think is kind of an important part of what I think is happening when you're a witch, when you're doing magic, which is you learn more and more how to pick up a sense of where you are. Where God, I'm not putting this well at all. Let's try this approach. So let's talk about deity. Actually, let's try going about it this way. Because one of the early notions about Christian religion and also about paganism, neo-paganism, that's basically has been giving me the most trouble, and which only lately have I figured out kind of ways of explaining it to my rational side. It's just this whole idea of deity in the first place. What is a deity? What is a god? Well, I'm not going to pretend that I have a definite answer to that. I will say only this, that it satisfies only part of my mind to think of a deity as something that really and truly exists only outside of my head, which is, I think, the conventional the conventional idea that most people in Western society are going to have about God and the gods is that we're supposed to regard them as entirely separate metaphysical entities. Metaphysical meaning simply deity exists in some fashion, we don't know what fashion, outside of the physical world. Because physics is basically simply what can we determine about the universe based entirely on what we think of as objective perception of it. In other words, rejecting the strictly subjective. In other words, stuff like my spiritual experiences in this view. If I wanted to be the strict scientist, the strict materialist about these things, I would have to regard my spiritual experiences as just null evidence. Like they don't indicate one thing or the other about the existence of anything outside of the physical realm. Or sorry, I should say, my spiritual experiences don't say anything about the physical realm. They might say something about the metaphysical realm, but a physicist, a scientist, isn't interested in that stuff in the first place. But the thing is, that's kind of the level on which, it's certainly the level on which a Christian believes. A Christian believes not only that there's a God, but that God has complete power over the physical universe that he could choose to exert at any time if he wants. That such a God is capable of miracles. Such a God would be capable of making a losing lottery ticket into a winning one. But while part of me really likes that idea, or at least is drawn to just the basic, again, childlike notion that yes, there's someone, not something, someone out there that is capable of hearing what I have to say, capable of listening to me, and capable of doing something about it. Part of me likes that idea. However, the larger part of me is that science geek grown up, and was never going to accept that as a notion of deity without a lot of just friction that would never go away. And that was a big problem when I was in my Wiccan phase earlier. It's just feeling like all the time I was Alright, is audio back? It looks like I need to keep... God. So, Alright, I'm gonna have to worry about this. Like, OBS was bad enough on Windows, but OBS on Linux is probably going to be absolutely horrible to live with. And I desperately need to train myself to keep better track of it. How long was it out, by the way? God, I just need to stare at the like the entire time at the view meter. Ugh. Anyway, so let's try to pick up the thread again. And I'm not going to be talking for much more than an hour, by the way. Like last time I talked for like an hour and 45 minutes or something like that. Yeah, I got other stuff to do. So, anyway, back to talking about gods. Like, the rational side of me, the science geek side, the Mona side, was never going to be happy. Just with a view of deity that was this sort of, yeah, they're out there and they can do shit. And I began slowly to develop an idea that, well, maybe deity is something that can live in my head and yet also have some sort of external life. And I think, well, how's that supposed to work? Well, here's my model, and one that I use when thinking of when I'm doing witchcraft stuff, because part of that is interacting. Like, I have experiences in which I imagine I interact with deities. And the most rationalistic, materialistic side of me regards that, and is happy with regarding that, simply as I am interacting with another aspect of my own personality. So, I mentioned last broadcast having this experience of Loki, and having had multiple experiences of Loki. Now, I could regard that I could simply see that as, well, you got a voice in your head and you talk to it. And okay, that sounds kind of bad. You think, well, what's the point of that? Oh, I'll tell you what the point is. The point is it's actually getting right at that issue of seeing magic as psychology that I didn't really know what to do with back when I first was trying to think about it that way, because I was still tending to think of, that, well, the point of magic was to interact with gods, who are supposed to be just out there, and you're supposed to believe in them. You're supposed to have faith and all the rest of that. Well, okay, that's kind of nice and everything, but like, that doesn't. If you don't really have that sort of faith, you can't fake it. There's no point in faking it. You can only really have, like, faith, to me, isn't about faith in an external entity. It's about having faith in your own perceptions, of believing your own model of the world. If you don't even have that, you don't really have much. You can't really put any sort of conviction into thing. You can't do things and simultaneously not really be sure that they actually mean anything to you. That you actually take them that seriously. So the start of getting anything useful out of a conception of deity basically had to start with a kind of a fundamental act of faith, if you want to put it that way. But anyways, a crucial decision that if I perceived that I was having interaction with a deity, then that was meaningful to me, even if it turned out that I was only talking to myself. Because guess what? Learning to talk to yourself is great applied practical psychology. Where it was that which started to get me out of the idea, that started to cure me of the habit of thinking of my brain as some sort of machine to be worked. That if I wanted to get it to do things, I had to kind of bash at it with stimuli. Like, I talked about how earlier, I think I may have talked a little bit about drug use and about using hallucinogens, and in the early days of that, so going back about 2 years max, sort of when I first started doing trying to use hallucinogens in a more systematic fashion than I had been, that I went through this phase of kind of viewing the hallucinogenic drugs, the psychedelic drugs, as tools for chiseling away at my brain in this sort of mechanistic fashion. Like, I wanted to do things like try to key music to doing certain things, and almost a sort of conditioning idea. Like, I had some idea that if I played music, then and then like did something else at the same time under the influence of the drug, that it would tend to impress, like it would tend to impress that sort of association on my brain, and that maybe I could change things that way. And I was doing that, and then basically I had a spiritual experience. It was a somewhat complicated one, and one that didn't take place entirely over a day. Like, there's kind of bits of information that were kind of gathered over multiple trips, but then ended up culminating in one trip where I made an actual I had a spiritual experience where I had an extended conversation with an entity whom I was eventually to dub the Engineer, and is not so a kind of a strictly personal god. Just someone who kind of tapped me on the shoulder and more or less said, hey buddy, you've really kind of got the wrong. You're going about things the wrong way. You should stop thinking of your brain as just this machine to be worked. It's you're being really hard on yourself. You're not getting the results that you want. Instead, you should deal with me. Like, if you want advice about how to get the most out of drug trips as a way of accomplishing stuff with your own brain, you should regard me as an intercessor. Now, that kind of sounds like the that sounds like the Christian model, right? It sounds a little bit like praying to God or appealing to a saint, because I'm a Catholic, love that, appealing to saints. The idea that, if you want to get something done, if you want God to do something for you, you could apply to them directly, or you could apply to an intermediary, which is what a saint is supposed to be. A saint is the soul of someone who is now in heaven, and who, because of their, virtuous life and all the rest of it, now have an in with the Lord, and they're on a kind of a lower level. They're up in heaven, and they have supernatural influence, but they're not a god. The saint's not a god. But in it, one can kind of like, in practice, a lot of Catholic saints actually sort of were gods. But anyway, that's getting off the point. And what that experience with the engineer ended up teaching me was that even if I regarded this entity that I made contact with, this engineer, even if I regarded them as strictly someone who lived in my mind, who was simply a figment of my imagination, that still meant that going to them for intercession meant something to me, as long as what I was trying to change was my own mind. It turned something. It turned an activity. This idea of affecting change on my psychology and my brain. It turned that from something that was really sort of impersonal and mechanistic, something that frankly did not feel good to do. Like, I felt like I was trying to psych myself out. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us who had abusive backgrounds and have, especially if, like me, you had massive dysphoria and and all the rest of that unpleasant shit from your childhood and from your youth. What ends up coming with that territory is that you end up not really thinking much about yourself, and you don't like yourself, you don't like your brain, and you just tend to you tend to think of it as something that you need to kind of control with like psychiatric drugs and stuff, and that's more or less the attitude that I'd kind of gone in with. But by instead dealing with this engineer who, if I were to sort of say what they were from the perspective of, like, if the engineer was an aspect of my personality, he represented that part of me, that scientific part of me that knew that was as deeply involved as possible with sort of actual knowledge of how the mechanism of my brain worked. The engineer was kind of my repository for all of the thoughts that I was beginning to develop about, that kind of cognitive behavioral stuff, like sort of like, okay, like why do I actually do things? Like, what stimuli are inducing me to behave in a certain way? And starting to think more dispassionately about my brain and my behavior in neutral, non-judgmental ways. So having a kind of personalized avatar for that, and I tended to imagine the engineer, by the way, in my head as a kind of a like old lab tech, like one of these guys that you sometimes see around universities that I really like. That they're on staff, they're not a scientist, they may not even have a science degree, but they'll know how all the equipment works. And they've been there for like 10 million years. Just someone who knows how to fix all the shit as it breaks. And, I met guys like this in college and like analytical labs and stuff like that. And I just loved them. They just seemed so smart. Just full of practical knowledge. And that kind of was my mental image of the engineer living in my head. Well, so that was my stepping stone to starting to think of deity in this sort of internal way. That deities were sort of packaged. I could think, if I wanted to, of deities as simply sort of packaged aspects of my own personal beliefs and behavior. Like, I could think of Loki, for example, if I wanted to, simply as I have a natural tendency towards being a bit of a rascal, being a trickster, and like maybe Loki is simply sort of the internal label that I put on that whole kind of package of tricksterish things. But here's the thing about sort of seeing Loki that way, is that Loki, yes, maybe they're that, but they are also, unlike the engineer, who's strictly personal, Loki is a shared idea. That I had a Loki. My friends, they have Lokis. Maybe they're not quite the same Lokis, but all of these different Lokis pass information back and forth between themselves through us, through human interaction. Because Loki isn't just an idea, isn't just a label that lives in my head. It's an idea that is constantly interacting with the rest of the universe, with the whole collective sort of shared knowledge about Loki. Loki is, in a sense, an entity that lives in a network. A network whose nodes are human brains, and whose interconnections are human communication. Not merely communication that happens in the here and now, but communication that has already happened. One can think of tradition in this sense. Tradition. So, myths about Loki, depictions of Loki, popular fiction about Loki. All of these things that now live in what I'll call what some people call the noosphere, the sphere of thought. They're all records of human interaction. They're stories that people have told, art that people has made, and it's all part of that vast network of nodes that exists now and has existed for hundreds, or if not thousands of years, in which Loki exists as a concept. And that was enough to bridge the gap in my mind from basically thinking about gods as external entities and thinking about gods as aspects of my own personality. This notion of deity as a sort of emergent property of a network of people was... I'm not going to say it's a very clear idea, but it was enough of a mental picture for me that finally I was able to kind of bridge the gap between the two halves of myself. The half that wanted to believe in the supernatural and wanted to believe in gods, and that if Loki wanted to, he could just show up at my door 10 minutes from now, and I don't know, ask for a cup of sugar or for some hazelnut creamer or something. Part of me still believes in that as something that can happen. The other part of me knows that, well, that's really, really unlikely. Again, probabilities. You can think of something. There's a difference between thinking of something as impossible and thinking of it as simply something that's probably never going to happen, but might. The universe might come through for you. So, being able to think of deities as entities that, even though they don't have any well-defined existence, are still kind of be given the same dignity of unified representation that you would give a thought. Like, the concept of a thought, we think of that as a single entity, even though we kind of know that there's no such thing as a thought in our brains. Like, it's simply a sort of pattern of neural signals that just sort of certain parts of our brain light up, and that to us is a thought, and we have no idea of we don't even know how to begin to sort of visualize, well, what does that actually look like physically? Like, what's going on in your head that corresponds with having a thought? Nevertheless, despite the vagueness of that physical picture, like, I think almost everyone will accept that a thought is a useful abstraction. It is simply easier to regard thoughts as entities and not as sort of vaguely diffuse properties of a network. And so, in like fashion, I've decided that deities are can be regarded in the same way as properties of a network, where the network is made up of all humanity. It's having reached that picture, it's basically, I mean, I don't regard the question of what a deity is as settled. It's settled for me. It's settled to the point where, oh, now I can start using this idea when I'm doing spells, because now I can think of, oh, if I'm calling upon the power of a deity in a spell, I'm simply making that bridge between what I kind of imagine, what my personal conception of the deity is, with, all right, well, what does the network tell me about this deity? Like, what outside information do I have about this concept that maybe lives 95 or 99% in my head? Well, anyway, that's a bit over an hour for me. That was a little bit unstructured. I am only just now starting to try to think about what I'm going to talk about first, and put a bit of actual planning into it. And as I've also said, I'm trying to move towards treating this more as a podcast with a definite release schedule of finished recordings, while still allowing people to tune in if they want and listen. Because, I'm going to be recording at odd times, and I can't expect people to be able to listen when I happen to be available to talk. Especially for this magic stuff. Like, the other broadcasts that I'm doing, the story readings, those I could kind of put on a fixed schedule, because it's just reading stuff. But when talking about magic broadcasts, it kind of is more going to be when the spirit's on me, and like, I can't always guarantee that I'm going to think of something that I can talk about, but I'm going to try. Well, thanks for listening, and sorry about technical problems. Again, Linux, nothing works. So, well, I'm going to have to get ready for work now. This is Kara Dreamer. Stay determined.